When looking for a good open world experience, I was kind of stunted as to the many games out there. On one hand, I don't have enough time to play another game like Red Dead Redemption 2, and it's extremely hard to find another open world game that is shorter than 25 hours, and that's just time I don't have to invest into a game at the moment. And so when looking around my library, I saw Mad Max, a game I tried to play a couple years prior and gave up after 10 minutes, and I saw it was only 12 hours long. Before very long, I was sucked into the haunting wastelands of Mad Max's open world, its exhilaratingly familiar gameplay system, and its surprisingly intriguing narrative. One of the core reasons I wanted to even try out the game was due to hearing that the game had that Arkham style of combat that I had become so accustomed to over the years, and one where its simplicity yet complexity in some aspects made it one of the most fun combat systems I've ever experienced in any games. Sure, the Arkham games weren't exactly revolutionary in their combat systems, but its free flow combat reveled in its simplicity and inspires open world superhero games even today, with games like Spider-Man taking obvious inspiration from the merits of the series' combat systems. Mad Max's combat does enough to make it, for me, a little more differentiated than simply just taking what worked in the Arkham games and applying a new coat of paint over it. Many times the game's combat felt a lot more calculated and slower than the adrenaline pumping and hectic combat that other games inspired by the Arkham series combat offered. Every other game with the combat system kept the core of it still being exhilarating at all times, having some sense of a hyper focus that kept the combat fresh and engaging. With Mad Max, that usually isn't the case, and kind of like Arkham Knight in a way, it's got two sides to the combat system. First, let's cover the traditional combat on foot. You've got a shotgun with minimal bullets, and often you'll have to scavenge around in order to get enough bullets every time you enter a new combat zone or area, and the shotgun is usually used in conjunction with the combat itself rather than it being used primarily as another option. There's of course the strike, heavy strikes, and parrying, which are all normal aspects of the Arkham style. And like the Arkham style, we've also got chain finishes, which do awesome combo moves in order to take down your enemies after a succession of hits against an enemy without getting hit yourself. Then you're able to use that shotgun that you're armed with in order to quickly take down an enemy and to make yourself some space before continuing onto the next enemies. It's a super fun combat system, and although especially at the start it feels a little bit campy and a lot slower than to what you're used to, it ramps up considerably after you get a couple hours into the game, making each combat scenario presented within the game an absolute blast to play through. Now quickly onto the vehicle combat of the game, which is also extremely fun as well. I personally didn't engage in vehicle combat too much outside the main story, but of what I did, the game's use of vehicles in a combat scenario was extremely fun to play through. Much like Max himself, the vehicle is also equipped with a variety of gadgets for the player to play around with, which also makes it quite diverse. I think quickly I'll preface on the fact that there is a lot of scavenging within Mad Max, and in order to aptly upgrade your vehicle and the different gadgets you have to utilize within the combat system, you need to make sure you're doing a bunch of scavenging, which in itself isn't too bad, as the story missions and bases you can clear out throughout the game within each region provide plenty of the materials you must require. On the vehicle itself, you've got a harpoon to pull out drivers or take out an enemy vehicle's wheels, and then you've also got a thunderpoon, which is an explosive weapon that can be shot at enemy vehicles and objects, which allows you to properly clear a base or a convoy when needed. The driving also feels extremely smooth, which I'll cover more in detail after, and the mechanics of it make it an absolute thrill to drive in and to engage in combat with. I can definitely say that without a doubt this game holds up extremely well even 7 years later in its overall direction in terms of presentation and the graphical fidelity that the open world characters and plot revels in. And so the open world here is absolutely stunning. The vistas of the buildings within the distance to the plain nothingness of a desert that stretches so far you can't see anything beyond its reaches for miles and miles. The world here is so well designed, so well crafted and fun to explore that you'll find yourself lost in the immersive state of the world here. I personally have not watched the Mad Max films and do not actually know much about the overall setting or atmosphere that those movies presented, but from what I have seen, the game here perfectly portrays the loneliness and wasteland nature of the setting in abundance. The world is kind of haunting in a way, where there is no sanity within the other inhabitants of this world, and you yourself aren't exactly anything that could be considered sane in the traditional sense. It's a wonder to explore the world of the game, and the way the game flawlessly translates the vibe of the movies into a game where you yourself interact with the world's inhabitants and the structures that encompasses its regions is a wonderful experience in its entirety. And your larger closest companion within this world that is so excellently designed is the car you have throughout the game. The story itself focuses on the development of this car to make it truly something that you can boast about, and the mechanics of the garage allows you to continuously upgrade your car, and as your journey continues on its path, the car itself becomes a much more viable option for exploration and combat and roaming the landscapes of the world. I think in a way this game's mechanics in terms of its car is also quite similar to the bike in Days Gone, where it continuously will break down if you do not take care of your vehicle, and while roaming around the wastelands of the game, you're also going to need to stop and find fuel cans in order to continue your journey. Some may find this an annoying mechanic that just slogs down the cycle of the gameplay overall, but personally I don't really agree with that. These sort of mechanics in terms of traversal and the way you're supposed to play in terms of caution makes it an immersive mechanic for me, and it ensures that you play the game in a way that is more calculated than just ramming your vehicle into every place you go or flying off cliffs without a second thought. The vehicle is supposed to be cared for, and that's because it's your main way to traverse the haunting wastelands of the game, and without it Max truly wouldn't be able to successfully achieve his objectives of survival, and its place as a tool of survival makes it even more treasurable to the player and thus Max himself. I'm actually not going to go into any spoilers here, as although this may serve as a review of the game many years later after its release, it's also for people who haven't played the game and may consider giving it a go after watching this video. The story here isn't one that I expected to be any good, and maybe that's because I don't know anything about the source material, and so I don't really understand the message that the game's story should be presenting when going into the game, but it was clearly evident from the very start that the title of Mad Max is one surely deserved by our anti-hero protagonist. He has no remorse for those around him, and it's evident that his only objective and the core motive that keeps him alive in these wastelands of deception and treachery is the instinct to survive. It's this human instinct to survive that encourages him to keep pushing, even when he suspects that he has nothing to live for. He's not a character that is so motivated by his perceptions of the world, but rather his primal belief that he needs to continue to survive for his own selfish desires that allows him to continue striving in a world that really, in all aspects, is not worth living in. It's a sad, lonely landscape of darkness and death, but Max persists only because he needs to, rather than his own desire to survive. Even when Max seemingly changes, it's only for but a moment, and his past memories of loss and tragedy makes him reluctant to create any sort of relationship or friendship with others because of his innate fear of losing it all again, and this makes him in every aspect an intriguing and peculiar character who truly wields no empathy for the world he fights trudgingly against. I hope you enjoyed this so-called review or retrospective look onto the Mad Max video game 7 years after its initial release, and I really did enjoy delving into the game, and it is one that is quite underrated among the other open world games out there at the moment and still is worth playing even today. It runs beautifully on even lower graphically capable devices, and so it's more accessible than ever before, and I really do recommend this if you're looking for a more concise and strained open world than the bloaty games that come out nowadays. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.